Good evening and welcome members and guests. My name is Kevin Kosick and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California. And on behalf of the book club, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2024 Oscar Lewis Awards. Now, for those of you that might be new to us, the book club is a nonprofit member and donor supported organization that was founded in 1912. Our mission is to preserve and promote the history of the book and the book arts, and we have a particular interest in the literature and the history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs, both here in San Francisco and in Southern California, on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, the Book Club of California is a community that is made up of collectors, printers, designers, booksellers, publishers, writers, and book lovers of all stripes. Membership in the Book Club of California is open to all, and if anyone is interested in joining, please speak with me or any member of the staff at any time. Now, tonight, we bring you an awards ceremony, not a lecture or a presentation. And as an awards ceremony, we will not be having a Q&A session after each of our little presenters' remarks. So you are more than welcome to stay after to talk to them, but we will not be taking Q&A during the ceremony. And now, to get us started, I'd like to introduce Paul Robertson, President of the Book Club of California's Board of Directors.
Thank you. Good evening, members and guests. I'm Paul Robertson. I am president of the Book Club of California. On behalf of the board and our members, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Oscar Lewis Awards. The Oscar Lewis Awards were established by the Book Club of California in 1994 in honor of Oscar Lewis, San Francisco author, historian, and Book Club of California secretary from 1921 to 1946. The Oscar Lewis Awards recognize outstanding contributions in two fields, Western history and book arts. Past awardees, and let's take a moment to acknowledge the past awardees, any that are here, if you would just stand or wave or okay. And yeah, some awardees over here too. The awardees include some of the most accomplished printers, designers, book artists, and historians. Some of them are with us here tonight and at the book club or joining us online via Zoom. Tonight's honorees are equally talented and impressive. First, I'd like to thank Dana Pollock for designing and printing the elegant letterpress invitations and certificates that we will be presenting to our honorees this evening. Yeah, that was probably very loud in the microphone. I would also like to thank Norman Clayton and Terry Castaneda, co-chairs of the Oscar Lewis Awards Committee. The committee is responsible for reviewing nominations from the members and selecting the honorees. Norman and Terry were assisted by committee members Rose Souza War Soldier, PhD, and Jennifer Robin Terry, PhD, Gloria Kundrup, and Stephanie Kimbo Dolan. Thank you all for your incredible work. Terry Castaneda and Stephanie Kimbo Dolan will be presenting the awards this evening. So just before I turn the podium over to them, I did want to make one acknowledgement. 14 years ago, we celebrated an equally happy day when we held our first event in these rooms, after which were referred to as the new rooms. Tonight is our last event in these event that will be held in these rooms, soon to be known as the old club rooms, before our move to 47 Kearney Street. That's kind of a sad occasion. I don't want to send rain clouds over anyone's good feelings for the awardees tonight. So Terry and Stephanie, if you would like to come up and take over the podium.
Good evening. I'm Terry Castaneda, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening to celebrate our Oscar Lewis Award honorees. Dr. Albert L. Hurtado is being recognized for achievement in Western history. Dr. Hurtado is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Oklahoma, where he held the Travis Chair in Modern American History and taught courses on the American West and Native America until his retirement in 2012. A prolific scholar, his publications have garnered numerous awards, including the Billington Prize for Indian Survival on the California Frontier, published in 1988 by the University of Oklahoma Press, the Nuremberg Award for Intimate Frontiers, Sex, Gender, and Culture in Old California, published in 1999 by the University of New Mexico Press, and the Coffee Prize for John Sutter, A Life on the North American Frontier, published in 2006 by the University of New Mexico Press. Professor Hurtado's most recent book is Herbert Eugene Bolton, Historian of the American Borderlands, published in 2012 by the University of California Press. In addition to these monographs and more than 60 book chapters and journal articles, he's also the editor of 2 textbooks, Major Problems in American Indian History and Reflections on American Indian History. Dr. Hurtado has served as past president of the Western History Association and the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association, and as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. In addition to holding academic appointments, he has worked since the 1970s as a public historian in the areas of historic preservation and cultural resource management. In recent years, he has worked on behalf of several California Indian tribes as an expert witness in cases involving land tenure, federal recognition, and tribal history. He's currently at work on a book of interpretive essays about California Indians. Program committee will have to watch out for that so we can have him back for a book talk. We often measure achievement solely in terms of an author's own publications, but professors also inspire new generations of scholarship. We recently co-hosted one of the co-authors of We Are the Land, a history of Native California. In the acknowledgements to that book, authors Damon Akins and William Bauer Jr. write, in part, the first person we need to recognize is our doctoral mentor, Albert Hurtado. Both of us worked with Al at the University of Oklahoma, where we wrote dissertations on aspects of California Indian history in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was a great pleasure to work with Al, and this book in some ways answers the questions he used to ask us, usually in the margins of our seminar papers. What is the story here? His work and guidance showed us that stories can carry great explanatory or analytical power, but they do so better when they, lost my place, sorry. They do so better when people show up in them. And those are just 2 of the former students he's mentored who've gone on to publish in the field of Western history. I want to close by saying that being here to present Dr. Hurtado with the Oscar Lewis Award in Western history is extra special because it takes me back to my first months in California. We arrived from Houston in the summer of 1994. Ken Owens, a professor of history at Cal State Sacramento and a Western historian in his own right, quickly announced that there were 3 things he was anxious to do for us. The first was to show us his favorite boat launch on the American River. The second was to show us the private library of his good friend and collector of a Western Americana, Michael Harrison, past book club president, I might add. And the third was to introduce us to his former student, Al Hurtado. Before the year was out, we saw the boat launch. We toured Mike Harrison's home, an astounding private library overlooking the American River Bluffs and Rapids in Fair Oaks. But introducing us to Dr. Hurtado would have to wait, since he was a professor at this time out at Arizona State. When I finally did meet Al, it was by sheer serendipity. Must have been around 2001 or so. I don't really remember, but I know exactly where it took place. It was in the California History Room of the State Library, where we were both doing archival research. Tonight is perhaps the third time our paths have crossed in all these years, and I couldn't be happier for the occasion. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Albert L. Hurtado, recipient of the 2024 Oscar Lewis Award in Western History. After I present him with this handsome letterpress certificate, he'll offer some remarks.
Beautiful.
For posterity. And by the way, the move from these quarters into 47 Kearny is really good. It's where the Grabhorns set up their first shop in San Francisco. So I, for one, am very excited. Now, Dr. Hurtado.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. One of the first things I did as an aspiring historian, I was given the duty to introduce W. Turntine Jackson. Some of you may remember Turpie Jackson, a distinguished historian at the University of California, Davis for many years. He was getting on in years at that time, and I was a little nervous about introducing him. He was quite a figure. And so I went up to him and I said, Turpie, I have to introduce you. Is there anything you'd especially like me to include in my introduction of you? And he looked at me, he said, just don't make it sound like I'm dead. So, I'm feeling very much alive. So it was a success. So first of all, I want to thank you sincerely, the Book Club of California, for presenting me with the Oscar Lewis Award. It came as a great and welcome surprise. I wasn't expecting it. And it's an honor to be associated with the distinguished past recipients. And I might say it's an honor to be associated with the Book Club of California. I am now a member and expect to remain a member for as long as I'm around. In any case, I'll treasure this award always. Now I'm going to speak for about 12 minutes. These are called remarks. And I was encouraged to speak about how I came to be an historian, and especially a historian of Native California. I'm not going to tell you who encouraged me, because she's here, and I wouldn't want anybody to blame her for what's to follow here. So my first encounters with history occurred when I was a kid. My family usually spent 1 week a month with my grandparents in Nevada City in a rambling old building that had once been a carriage factory. Nothing from the old days had been thrown away. You could have built a carriage with the parts and tools that were still in the building. A huge, spooky attic was piled high with antiques of one kind or another. Cast iron toys, old clothes, books, pictures, carpenter's chests, a physician's valise with scalpels and a amputation saw caught my eye. When I was in elementary school, I read about the Plains Indian Wars in disintegrating Harper's Weekly newspapers piled on the floor. The place was like a museum of the 19th century American West, except with signs that read, "Touch everything." I did. Meanwhile, in Sacramento, my parents thought I should attend a church that happened to be across the street from Sutter's Fort. After Sunday school, I begged to go to the fort, and they usually gave in. In the 1950s, there was next to nothing about the Indian workers who had built the place, tilled Sutter's fields, and tended his herds. I recall an exhibit that featured a mannequin dressed as an Indian prisoner who had been jailed for some infraction. But that was about it. And that was okay by me. I grew up in an era when Westerns were all the rage. As I walked around the fort, I imagined flaming arrows coming over the walls and stalwart John Sutter protecting settlers with the big guns in the fort's bastions. Then one day, I wandered outside the fort to an unassuming building in the rear. California State Indian Museum, the sign read. Inside, there were a lot of baskets, bows and arrows, and paintings of Indian life as some artist imagined it to be. I remember one rendering that depicted an Indian shaman transforming into a deer. I was astonished at the idea. I looked into an exhibit case and saw an Indian's skeletal remains. What was I supposed to learn from that? That Indians had bones? Then I spied another exhibit on the floor with low glass partitions that enclosed another skeleton that was displayed as if an archaeologist had just unearthed it. But there was something odd about this skeleton. There were a couple of dozen arrowheads stuck in the bones. The exhibit label explained that this man had been killed by his community for some transgression, perhaps sorcery. I remembered the picture of the man becoming a deer. I suppose the executed man was someone like him. And that was my introduction to California Indian culture. There was nothing to indicate that Indians still lived in my time, or that Indians had worked at the fort in the past. Indians were long gone exotic beings whose remains were fit objects for public display. But they had no place in history. History was about white people, Sutter, settlers, my family. I saw no contradiction in the images of the past that I saw at the fort, the museum, and my grandparents' attic. I did not resolve to become a historian or to revise our notions about the past. I was not outraged about the exhibit of human remains. I did not have nightmares about the gruesome skeleton stuck with arrowheads. At my age then, gruesome was kind of cool. While I did not think deeply about history, I was immersed in it more intensely than others of my age. I thought it was fun and interesting, and I completely swallowed the mythology of the American frontier. The conquest of the American West was a good thing. There were plenty of heroes, like Sutter, and I didn't think about victims. Indians were merely a problem that had to be overcome. And then they were gone, and that was it. My first serious thoughts about history came as an undergraduate at Sacramento State College, where I majored in, wait for it, history. In my senior year, I had to write a thesis based on original sources. So naturally, I turned to the papers from the carriage factory. My father and I spread them out on a table. I saw nothing of interest until I got to a large ledger book. I figured it would contain columns of numbers. I opened and found a handwritten title page. Secret Minutes of the Nevada City Law and Order League, 1909. Now that's more like it. Confidential vigilante tales from my great-grandfather's pen. What luck. Now, the activities of the Law and Order League turned out to be more prosaic than I had hoped. Instead of a bunch of hard-fisted heroes bent on bringing bad guys to justice, they were a bunch of tight-fisted businessmen determined to reform the hard-drinking society of a mining town. They backed a proposition on the Nevada City ballot that would close saloons on Sundays. No gun smoke, no fisticuffs. What a disappointment. just a bunch of sober middle-class do-gooders who operated in secret because they didn't want to lose business from their political opponents. Closing saloons on the only day that most working men had off was a tough sell in a mining town. Of course, the proposition failed, and the Law and Order League was forgotten entirely until I found the minutes in 1968. While the history of this failed reform effort was far less dramatic than what I initially imagined, researching it was anything but boring. I scoured libraries, archives, and newspapers for months looking for more information. Who were these people? What sort of place was Nevada City in 1909? Where did the Law and Order League and Sunday closing ordinances fit into the larger themes of progressive reform and the temperance movement? I became completely engrossed in the process of research and discovery. And one Sunday winter afternoon, I sat at my desk and thought, now, if I could only find a way to do this for the rest of my life. I didn't know how to realize that nascent idea, but I remember having it as clearly as I can remember anything. I only had a vague idea of what history professors did when they weren't teaching and couldn't imagine anyone being paid for what I was doing. It was just too much fun. So my thesis was a success. I graduated and reluctantly joined the Army. It was 1969. I got lucky and wound up in South Korea, where I began to think about colonialism and the subjugation of indigenous people around the world. By the time I was discharged, I was determined to go to graduate school, and the age of Indian activism was underway. Maybe I should look into the history of the Nisenan and Miwok people who lived near Sacramento. And so I did. But those formative years, those are what set my life course on the historical trail that has taken me to university posts around the country and finally back home to my native California. Since retirement, I've been working on behalf of Native people, work that continues to surprise and educate me, as one example illustrates. A few years ago, a Native leader told me one of his ancestors was mentioned in Sutter's New Helvetia Diary, a daily journal of events at Sutter's Fort published by the Grabhorn Press in 1939. I was familiar with it. I had scraped together $125 to buy it when I was a less than well-paid assistant professor. It is a treasured possession that I value as much for Grabhorn's fine press work as for its historical content. I knew that there were more Indian names in the diary and decided to make an index of them. I figured that would be an easy task. Just go to the index called Persons at the Fort and pick out the Indian names, right? But no, the editors omitted any Indian names, including those who were repeatedly mentioned and obviously played an important role in Sutter's enterprise. This was not a casual oversight, but a considered editorial decision. To them, only white people were persons. The New Helvetia Diary was meant to celebrate white pioneers, just as the fort itself whitewashed Sutter's history. When critics speak of history silencing people of color, this is the sort of thing they're talking about. The selective index of the diary was one thing, but the text was something else again. Indians could not be omitted from the daily entries without eviscerating the diary's value as a historical source. I expected to find at most a few dozen Indian names, but no. There are more than 200 named Indians in the New Helvetia Diary, plus 68 entries for unidentified Indians and scores of references to Indian communities associated with the fort. Even though I knew that Native people were crucial to the operation of Sutter's frontier establishment, I did not expect numbers of that magnitude. The naming of particular Indians speaks to their importance in the minds of Sutter and his clerks. Some were tribal leaders, others were soldiers in Sutter's Indian army, some possessed special skills, some were enslaved, and others were free. All were individuals enmeshed in a colonial society that they fashioned on the California frontier. These Native people deserve to be known to history, not as an afterthought, but as primary actors in an ongoing drama that we all are part of. Since 1939, I'm pleased to say that things have changed for the better. Some tribes with newfound wealth and political influence from gaming that was unimaginable a generation ago now have something to say about just how things are done, how a place like Sutter's Fort is interpreted, for example. A new California Indian Museum is being constructed miles away from the fort that California Indians view as a bitter reminder of their subjugation. Meanwhile, the fort is being reinterpreted with Indian history in mind. Future visitors, even kids like I was, should not be able to walk away from the place without thinking about the Indians who built it. Nor should they come away with a naive image of Sutter as the benign founder of their hometown. The history of that place and all the people who made it is far more complicated than that. Simplifications won't do. Thanks to Native critics and historians, our understanding of Sutter's Fort is more complex and complete than it once was. But we must be mindful that the artifacts of racism and conquest remain embedded in the very fabric of history. The bricks of the fort fashioned by Indians' hands, and the smooth elisions in sources like the New Helvetia Diary. Silences are powerful, but voices are too. We must reimagine the fort and all of California as a place filled with Native people with voices speaking many indigenous languages. And in that spirit, I conclude with a few names from the New Helvetia Diary. Anashe, Chave, Shuhuli, Ashe, Peli, Chable, Dolahuk, Chadyuk, Tokachi, Chupu, Waishakma, Dobit, Yokache, and 200. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. That was wonderful. Congratulations. Next, to present the 2024 Oscar Lewis Award for the Book Arts, please welcome Stephanie Kimbrough Dolan.
Thank you, Terry. Good evening, everyone. I am honored to be able to award the 2024 Oscar Lewis Award for the Book Arts to my dear friends and wonderful book artists and friends to many of us in the book arts community, Lawrence Van Velzer and Peggy Gotthold. Foolscap Press is the creation of Larry and Peggy. Working together as a team for many years, they have produced limited edition handmade books from their home studio in Santa Cruz. Larry operates the printing presses and Peggy handles the bookbinding. Both contribute to the ideas and design behind each book and collaborate with artists and illustrators throughout the process. In addition to producing limited edition books, Foolscap handprints and binds chapbooks and ephemera that are sent out to friends, family, and book subscribers. One such annual publication, which I know many of us in this room are familiar with, is the popular April Fool's Day Keepsake, a humorous chapbook written and printed by Larry and illustrated and sewn by Peggy. Both Larry and Peggy worked in California in book production for many years. Peggy established the in-house bindery at Arion Press. Before that, the press had outsourced its bindings to the Schuberth bookbindery where Peggy worked. In addition to her bookbinding background, Peggy trained in letterpress printing and typesetting at Cowl Press, Yalabali Press, and Artichoke Press. Larry learned printing in technical high schools and was a letterpress printer, having learned printing from his father, who published a newspaper printed on a hand press. Larry operated his own press and worked as a printer and typesetter at Arion, where he met Peggy. When Peggy and Larry left Arion Press, they began making their own limited edition books as Foolscap Press. Both have been active in supporting the book arts and book artists for decades, attending Codex Book Fair and symposia, and being generous in sharing their knowledge of bookmaking and providing mentorship to other printers, bookbinders, and book artists in California. Foolscap Press's books can be found in special collections, libraries, and institutions internationally. Notable works include Direction of the Road by Ursula K. Le Guin with woodcuts by Aaron Johnson, Desert Dreams, a story by Larry with illustrations by Peggy, and their latest publication, Thomas Paine in His Own Words with calligraphy by Thomas Ingmeyer. My personal favorite book, Foolscap Press book, is The Story of the Fisherman from Arabian Nights with illustrations by Brian Bowles. I show this book to guests of my library who've never been exposed to the book arts before. They brought together everything in this book that I think encompasses what book arts can be. It's the typography, the page design, pochoir illustration, and an accordion binding structure. Even the cover illustrations were inspired by an illuminated page from a Quran from 1313. It's this culmination of the unique content and unique binding and beautiful printing. And it creates this reading experience for whoever is looking and holding it. And it's what I use to help explain what handmade books and book arts are all about to the uninitiated. Please join me in congratulating Lawrence Van Velzer and Peggy Gotthold, recipients of the 2024 Oscar Lewis Awards for the Book Arts. Now I'll invite them to give a few remarks.
Thank you for giving us the Oscar Lewis Award. We're very pleased to be here to accept it and to be in your company. We were notified that we were recipients of this award on April 2nd, so close to our favorite holiday that we quite naturally thought it might be some kind of prank. We tend to be even less serious around the 1st of April and figure there are other people who feel the same way. The name Foolscap Press is appropriate for us because foolscap has the dual meaning of a size of paper and the hat the professional fool wears. This way we can work at perfecting our craft, and yet it keeps us from taking ourselves too seriously.
Because the Oscar Lewis Award celebrates both book arts and Western history, I have a bit of family letterpress history to share. And as the professor here will tell you, history, you don't really quite get it exactly right the first time. So I'll do a little bit of correction here. Metal type and letterpress printing runs continuously in my family since the Civil War era. If my grandfather's father hadn't been killed in that war, my grandfather, that is Gilbert Francis Van Velzer, may not have been apprenticed to a printer at age 11. That was the beginning of a 6-year apprenticeship for him. When he was finished with that, he was free to travel anywhere he wanted. My grandfather, as a 17-year-old, was ready to set out as a tramp printer. All he needed was his own pica gauge, a makeup rule, and a printer's apron. This grandfather of mine traveled from New York West to Kansas, started a newspaper at age 23 there, and got married to a woman who could set type, and then continued on west until he reached the ocean. This was in Fallbrook in San Diego County, where he set up, printed, published a weekly newspaper called the Fallbrook Review. It was printed on a hand press, the Washington hand press, which had been sent by ship around the Horn from Boston. This press apparently sat on the porch of the family home for many years after grandfather and the newspaper parted ways. It's a press I wish I had now. Everyone in the family, meaning 5 boys and 3 girls, and my grandmother, helped put out the newspaper. Of those kids, several of them followed their father in a printing trade. One of them, my Uncle Claire, wrote of those early days. It was a time when the El Camino Real was still a dirt road. He described moving printing equipment in 1908 with a hired horse and wagon. The owner of the horse had neglected to mention that the horse would rear straight up on his hind legs and walk backward when an automobile approached. This turned out to be an inconvenience. They saw 2 automobiles in 2 days. One could hear the approach of an automobile from a long way off, and the horse became agitated. Grandfather got off the wagon, held the reins, and soon he was pulled dangling into the air. He wasn't very tall, man. Settling back on the ground as the automobile disappeared into the cloud of dust. The second automobile encounter was less fortunate, however. This time, on the curve of a hilly road, when the horse reared, my grandfather was not able to hold him and had to leap clear as the horse overturned the wagon. He watched as the load cascaded down into a ravine, pulling the horse with it. Fortunately, the horse was uninjured. My grandfather had to return with help the next day to retrieve lead type that you might describe as being tied. And that was what was left of the wagon as well. Some of that type may still be down in that ravine today. My father, born in 1899, became a teacher and taught the Black Arts of letterpress at Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles. This was a time when you could leave high school and go out and get a good job working at a letterpress shop or newspaper. Manual Arts High School is still around today and is one of the oldest high schools in Los Angeles. No doubt the old letterpress equipment has been moved out to make room for culinary arts or something more up-to-date like building robo-taxis. I had my own letterpress equipment when I met Linnea Gentry in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the early 1980s. She was working her own press in a historic plaza. I was looking for a paying job, but like most small publishers, she wasn't hiring. Linnea did tell me that Andrew Hoyan in San Francisco might hire a printer. As I was going in that direction with my line gauge and makeup rule, etc., I called on Mr. Hoyan. Turned out Arian Press had just gotten hold of a large Miller 2-color letterpress with Jerry Redden at the controls, and they did need a tramp printer of sorts. I ended up working there for 12 years, which makes me a poor excuse of a tramp printer. Once Arion Press situated itself under the same roof as McKinsey and Harris, later M&H Type Foundry, that enabled Peggy and I to meet nearly all the letterpress printers in the Bay Area and beyond. The foundry was a kind of mecca where everyone came to visit to see Helen Lee when they ordered fonts or had typeset cast, and to pick up their jobs from Bob Miller in the shipping department. And of course, people invariably showed up at lunchtime so that it appeared that none of us ever worked. We liked that image, but we also had occasionally worked during our decreasing lunch hour. For my part, I am happy to continue doing what generations of folks in my family have been doing, enjoying the smell of fresh ink on paper and handling stick and a type. Type and a stick.
Although my family records a Christian Gotthold who worked as a bookbinder in the late 1700s in Kaiserslautern, Germany, to whom I'm directly related, there are a lot of intervening years with relatives in many professions. As a girl, I thought my grandmother had led an exciting life full of adventure. In my favorite photograph of her, she and her sister are standing in the gondola of a hot air balloon, wearing wonderful large hats. At a certain point, I realized that the photograph was taken in a studio, though none of my immediate relatives ever disillusioned me. It remains my favorite photograph of her and reminds me of her esprit and elegance. My father taught physics and my mother was a librarian. Further back, we need not go. There's too much variety for a romantic tale, much like my career, working at many things, including some bookbinding classes with Bob Lucas in the 1970s. In 1985, I signed up for an apprenticeship at Yola Bowley Press, past recipients of the Oscar Lewis Award, then worked for Jonathan Clark, another recipient. Then the Schubert Bookbindery, where I learned to say, "It's not my fault," in 5 languages. After that, I worked at Arion Press for 12 years. Andrew Hoyen is another recipient. Some of those previous other things helped me get the job at Arion Press because Andrew hired me not as a trained bookbinder, but because I could hang sheetrock, and they were doing a bit of remodeling at Arion Press and the Type Foundry. I've also studied with Eleanor Ramsey, another recipient of this award.
We know or have known, been friends, have worked for or with many or most of the past recipients of this award. That's a sentence I won't try to repeat. We could probably tell stories about each one of them. And as one would expect, most of the stories are true. As for example, when Jack Stoffaker received an early April Fool's keepsake from us and wrote back saying, "What is this?" The caps, if you could see them, are his. Of course, it was a surprise for our favorite holiday. It was letterpress, that's the important thing. And that it might be amusing or droll or entertaining, it didn't matter. Jack quit asking after a while, and we've been sending these things out for more than 25 years. We've always admired the Book Club of California from afar, but assumed that not many people here knew about us, hidden away as we are in Santa Cruz. In fact, most people in Santa Cruz have no idea what we do. Sometimes we don't seem to know ourselves, except that we try to surprise ourselves. This in spite of Jane Austen, who in Emma states, "Surprises are foolish things. The pleasure is not enhanced, and the inconvenience is often considerable." And I say, but dear Mr. Knightley, we are foolish things.
I too would like to take a turn in the parlor with Mr. Knightley and say there's often pleasure in being foolish at little inconvenience, and point out that the one thing you can or must do in this business is to surprise yourself. If you can't do that, then you're not going to delight or surprise any audience you have for your books. We have a lot of wacky ideas, some of which we try out. Quite simply, to follow our interests. If you're a collector of foolscap press books, you never know what you'll be getting, and that can be somewhat alarming or unnerving. In your attempt at shelving foolscap press books, you'll find some of them don't get along particularly well. Some of the books are large, some elfin. I make portfolio boxes for some, but nothing for others. Some have special kinds of bindings, some are more conventional. We suppose that our philosophy, if we have one, is to not know exactly how our books are going to turn out in their final form. We try to give each book time to tell us what it needs to morph on its own. Of course, that's a process that will slow down any publishing program, and probably one reason we only produce a single book a year for the most part. Maybe it's easiest to picture foolscap press in the graphic form of the fool in the tarot deck, who's associated with the number 0, a cipher, a freedom from limitation, a wholeness containing all of its potential. He is blithely about to take a step. Is it into the abyss? Is it along a path? A step up or down? No worries, as they say. See where the next step leads. So our thanks go to family for the ink in Larry's veins, and thanks to those teachers, mentors, and friends, some gone now, some here today in the audience. And finally, our very great thanks go to the Book Club of California for this great honor. We did print a small keepsake for this occasion. It explains from a printer's point of view about typos. And it explains why generations of textual scholars have been kept busy. Last year, we spent some time working on some work related to the 400th anniversary of the printing of Shakespeare's first folio. And it was a piece we ran across from Isaac Jaggard, one of the printers of the first folio. And it was actually done for the Decameron. So he set himself up a couple years earlier to explain all the mistakes in the first folio. Anyway, we have it here.
So you'll be able to come up in just a few moments to get a copy of this wonderful keepsake. So Larry and Peggy, congratulations. Thank you so much for those great words. And thank you everyone here in the club rooms and joining us on Zoom for being part of the 2024 Oscar Lewis Awards. I'm so glad we were able to gather together one more time here in the now new club rooms, soon to be old club rooms, before we meet again in our new space at 47 Kearney. Again, I look forward to meeting you all there in the future. This now concludes the presentation of the 2024 Oscar Lewis Awards. Thank you again for being with us. Thank you for your support of the Book Club of California. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.